I never considered myself the type of person to have neighbor drama. My life, by design, was a quiet affair. I'm an architect, a profession that demands a certain appreciation for structure, for lines, for boundaries. I work from a sun-drenched office in my home, sketching blueprints that bring order to empty spaces. My days are a calm rhythm of coffee, calculations, and the soft scratch of a pencil on vellum. I keep to myself, I follow the rules, and I expect the same courtesy in return. It's a simple social contract, one that had served me well until the day Deborah Winters was elected president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. Most people, with a practiced diplomacy born of suburban survival, called her Deborah to her face. But in whispered conversations over fences, in frustrated text messages, and in the collective groan that rippled through community meetings, she was simply Karen. It wasn't her real name, of course, but it had become a title, an identity. She had earned with a relentless campaign of petty tyranny. She embodied every stereotype of the entitled, rule-obsessed neighbor that turns the dream of peaceful suburban living into a waking nightmare. When I bought my craftsman-style home 3 years ago, the HOA was a benign, almost invisible entity. The president was a retired judge named Arthur Penhaligon, a man who understood the difference between governance and oppression. He ran meetings with a quiet efficiency, his decisions rooted in fairness and common sense. Under his leadership, the HOA was what it was supposed to be, a simple framework for maintaining community standards, not a weapon for personal vendettas. But Judge Penhaligon, chasing the sun, moved to Florida last year. His departure created a power vacuum, and into that void stepped Deborah, radiating an ambition that was frankly terrifying. She campaigned for the presidency with the ferocity of a political incumbent fighting for their life. Her platform was built on vague but menacing promises to restore property values and enforce standards. What that translated to, in practice, was the beginning of her reign of terror. The first casualties were the small, harmless quirks that made our neighborhood feel like a community. Mrs. Chin, an elderly woman who had lived on our street for 40 years, was the first to feel the sting. She received a $50 fine, delivered by certified mail, because her garbage can was visible from the sidewalk for a full hour after the collection truck had passed. The Johnsons, a young family with 2 small children, received a formal warning letter, written in an aggressive red font, because their cheerful holiday lights remained up 3 days past the arbitrary January 5th deadline. For months, I managed to stay off her radar. I became a meticulous student of our 32-page covenant. My lawn was mowed to the regulation 2.5 inches. My recycling bin was a ghost, appearing on the curb precisely at dawn and vanishing the moment it was emptied. I was a model of beige conformity, a ghost in the suburban machine. My peace was maintained through meticulous, exhausting compliance. That all changed the day spring arrived. The source of the conflict, the ground zero of my war with Deborah, was a magnificent maple tree that stood in my backyard. It was a grand old thing, its branches a sprawling canopy that had been there when I bought the house. It was perfectly positioned, a natural umbrella that cast a cool, dappering shade over my home office during the brutal summer afternoons. More importantly, according to the official property survey I had signed at closing, it was unequivocally mine. The trunk stood a solid 4 feet inside my property line, a fact as clear and indisputable as the ink on the deed. One Saturday morning, I was at my drafting table, lost in the intricate lines of a new design. The house was quiet, the only sound the whisper of my pencil and the distant chirping of birds. Then, a new sound intruded, an unfamiliar mechanical roar that shattered the morning peace. It was the sound of a chainsaw. I walked to the window that overlooked my backyard and nearly dropped my coffee mug. The sight that greeted me was so audacious, so profoundly violative, that for a moment my brain refused to process it. There, standing in the middle of my yard as if she owned it, was Deborah Winters. She was directing two men in work clothes, pointing with a long manicured finger at the limbs of my maple tree. As I watched, one of the men revved his chainsaw and bit into a thick, healthy branch, sending a shower of sawdust onto my lawn. I didn't even bother to put on shoes. I threw open the back door and rushed outside, the damp grass cool beneath my bare feet. "What do you think you're doing to my tree?" I yelled, my voice louder than I had intended. Deborah turned, her expression not one of surprise or apology, but of mild annoyance, as if I were the one interrupting something important. She was wearing a pair of designer sunglasses despite the overcast day, and her highlighted blonde bob was styled to perfection. She held a clipboard to her chest like a shield. She looked less like a neighbor and more like a film director on set, orchestrating a scene rather than committing an act of blatant vandalism. "Oh, good morning," she said, her tone infuriatingly calm. "The branches are extending over the property line. They're dropping sap on my new patio furniture." She tapped the clipboard. "The HOA bylaws clearly state in Section 12, Paragraph 4, that no foliage shall encroach on neighboring properties." "That may be true," I said, my heart pounding with a mixture of anger and adrenaline, "but you can't just enter my property and start cutting down my tree without my permission. That's trespassing." "Actually," she said, and a condescending smile played on her lips, a smile I had come to know and despise from the HOA meetings. "As HOA president, I have the authority to address violations directly. I sent you a notice about this last week." She hadn't. It was a bald-faced lie, and the casual way she delivered it was breathtaking. We both knew no notice had been sent, no warning given. This was a unilateral act of aggression. I took a deep, steadying breath. I am not a confrontational person by nature. My entire life is built around avoiding such unpleasantries. But this was a violation that could not be ignored. This was a line, both literal and figurative, that had been crossed. The two men with the chainsaws had shut them off, and were now looking deeply uncomfortable, two reluctant soldiers caught in the crossfire of their general's foolish war. "Please," I said, my voice now low and firm, "ask your contractors to stop cutting immediately. If branches need to be trimmed, I will hire a professional arborist myself. You are on my property without permission. I need you to leave." "Well, since we're already here," she began, gesturing for the men to continue their work. That was it. The last thread of my patience snapped. I pulled out my phone. "If they cut one more branch," I said, my thumb hovering over the 911 icon, "I am calling the police to report trespassing and destruction of property." That finally got their attention. The workers looked at each other, then to Deborah, for direction. Her face flushed a deep, blotchy red, not from embarrassment, but from the pure, unadulterated rage of being challenged. She, the queen of Oak Ridge Estates, was being told, "No!" "Fine," she snapped, her voice a low hiss. "I will have my attorney send you a formal notice, and you can expect a violation letter for this unkempt, overgrown tree. You have 3 days to address it properly." She turned on her heel and marched away, the two workers trailing behind her like chastised children. They left, but not before leaving behind several gaping wounds in the canopy of my beautiful maple, and a declaration of war lying on the grass in the form of sawdust and severed limbs. I stood there for a long time after they were gone, documenting everything with my phone's camera. I took pictures of the cut branches, the sawdust on my lawn, and, most importantly, the clearly visible property line markers in several of the shots. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me, that this was far from over. This was only the beginning. The initial shock of the chainsaw incident subsided, leaving behind a cold, hard resolve. Deborah Winters had drawn a line, not on the manicured lawns of Oak Ridge Estates, but in the sand of our burgeoning conflict. She had trespassed, she had lied, and she had vandalized my property. She had mistaken my quiet nature for weakness, and I was about to patiently, methodically prove her wrong. The battle she had started would not be fought with chainsaws and shouting matches. It would be a war of paper, of bylaws, of documentation and evidence. It was a language I understood far better than she did. True to her word, a formal HOA violation notice appeared in my mailbox that afternoon. It was a masterpiece of petty bureaucracy, citing not only the infamous Section 12, Paragraph 4 about encroaching vegetation, but also a newly discovered Section 8, Paragraph 2 regarding aesthetic maintenance standards. The notice, typed in an aggressive all-caps font, demanded that I remove the diseased and unsightly maple tree within 7 days or face daily fines of $100. The tree wasn't diseased. It was a pillar of health, now wounded but still very much alive. This wasn't about bylaws anymore. This was a naked power play. She wasn't trying to enforce a rule. She was trying to force a surrender. My first move was not to engage with her directly. Arguing with a person like Deborah was like wrestling with a pig in mud. You both get dirty, and you quickly realize the pig enjoys it. Instead, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to a certified arborist, a man named Sam who had a quiet reverence for trees that I found reassuring. He arrived the next morning, his brow furrowed with concern as he examined the haphazard cuts on my maple. His assessment was swift and professional. As expected, he provided a detailed signed report confirming that the tree was in excellent health. He noted with thinly veiled professional disgust that the unauthorized trimming was poorly executed and had left the tree's canopy unbalanced, but that the tree itself was in no danger of dying. It was not, he wrote in bold letters, a hazard. My second call was to my lawyer. I didn't need one yet, but in a war, you assemble your allies before the first shot is fired. I explained the situation, and he gave me a simple but powerful piece of advice. Document everything. Respond to nothing without a paper trail, and let her make the mistakes. Armed with the arborist's report, I spent the rest of the day dissecting the 32-page HOA covenant, reading it not as a homeowner, but as an architect, analyzing its structure, its clauses, its hidden weaknesses. And I found one. It was a beautiful, elegant little clause tucked away in the section on board governance. It stated that any HOA board member with a direct personal interest or conflict in a dispute must formally recuse themselves from all related discussions, votes, and enforcement actions. Deborah, as my direct next-door neighbor with a personal grievance about sap on her patio furniture, was in clear violation of her own rule book. I drafted a formal response. It was not an angry letter, but a cold, professional document. I addressed it to the HOA board, copying every single member except Deborah. In it, I calmly and methodically outlined the sequence of events: the unannounced entry onto my property, the unauthorized tree trimming, and the subsequent fraudulent violation notice. I attached a copy of the arborist's report, a copy of my property survey, and the high-resolution photos I had taken of the trespassing and the damage. I concluded the letter by respectfully pointing out the bylaw regarding board member recusal and suggesting that all further communication on this matter be handled by the remaining impartial members of the board. I sent it via certified mail, ensuring a legal record of its delivery. The response was faster and more surprising than I had anticipated. That evening, my phone rang. It was Michael, another board member, a retired engineer who lived 3 streets over. "I just wanted to call you personally and apologize," he said, his voice heavy with frustration. "Several of us on the board have been growing concerned about Deborah's leadership style. She's been acting unilaterally, making decisions without consulting us, and this is a new low." He explained that Deborah had a small, loyal faction on the board, but that the majority were volunteers who, like Judge Penhaligon, believed in fair and reasonable governance. They were tired of her constant crusades and worried about the potential legal liability she was creating for the entire association. "We've seen your letter," he assured me. "The violation has been voided. No action will be taken regarding your tree. We're going to have a talk with her." For a brief, naive moment, I thought that would be the end of it. I had followed the rules, I had presented my evidence, and the rational members of the board had responded accordingly. I had won. But I had underestimated the sheer stubborn force of Deborah's ego. For her, this was no longer about a tree. It was about her authority. And she was not about to let a stack of evidence and a few spineless board members stand in her way. 3 days later, I had to visit a client's construction site an hour away. I left early in the morning feeling a sense of relief for the first time in weeks. The sky was clear, the air was warm, and I allowed myself to believe that normalcy was returning to Oak Ridge Estates. I was wrong. I returned home around 2 in the afternoon. As I turned onto my street, an immediate, cold sense of dread washed over me. There was an unusual amount of activity near my house. A large, unmarked truck from a company called Karen's Cut Rate Tree Service, a name so on the nose it was almost comical, was parked in front of my home. My heart sank. I saw men with chainsaws in my backyard again. But this time, they weren't just trimming branches. They were making deep, decisive cuts into the main trunk of my maple tree. I slammed on my brakes, leaving my car in the middle of the street, and jumped out. Deborah was standing there, in her designer workout clothes, supervising the execution with a look of serene, satisfied victory on her face. She had parked her bright red convertible BMW, her pride and joy, directly across the street, presumably to give herself the best possible view of the spectacle. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice raw as I ran towards the workers. "Stop right now!" The men paused, their chainsaws idling with a low growl. Deborah stepped forward, holding up a single piece of paper like a royal decree. "I have authorization from the HOA to remove this hazardous tree," she said, her voice filled with smug triumph. "It's a safety issue now, and safety concerns," she added, her eyes glittering with malice. "Don't require homeowner permission for immediate action." I snatched the paper from her hand, my fingers trembling slightly with a rage I was struggling to contain. It was on official HOA letterhead, a hastily typed paragraph declaring my healthy maple tree an imminent safety hazard due to structural instability. At the bottom was a single defiant signature: Deborah Winters. The required 3 board member signatures for an emergency action were conspicuously absent. It was a forgery, a pathetic and transparent fabrication of authority, and she was waving it in my face as if it were a court order. "This is fraudulent." "And you know it," I said, my voice dangerously low. "Tell them to stop, immediately, or I'm calling the police right now." She just shrugged, a picture of unconcerned arrogance. "They're almost done anyway. The tree was compromised from the earlier trimming. It could have fallen at any time." The sheer audacity of her logic was stunning. She was blaming the tree's fictitious instability on the very damage she herself had illegally orchestrated weeks before. The workers, caught in the middle of this escalating war, were now looking deeply uncertain. They glanced at the deep cuts in the trunk, then at me, then back at the furious woman who had hired them. "Guys," I said, addressing the crew directly, my voice firm and clear, "this woman does not have the legal authority to remove my tree. You're on my property without my consent. If you continue, you will be held liable for damages right along with her. I have a signed report from a certified arborist proving this tree is healthy." That was the magic word: liable. One of the workers, a burly man who looked like he might be the foreman, immediately shut off his chainsaw. "Ma'am," he said, turning to Deborah, his tone now wary, You told us you had the homeowner's permission and all the proper authorization. Deborah's face, which had been a mask of smug satisfaction, began to contort with anger. I am the authorization, she spat, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. I am the president of the Homeowners Association. At that exact moment, my phone, which I was still clutching in my hand, began to ring. I looked at the screen. It was Michael, the board member who had called me before. I answered it, putting it on speaker for everyone to hear. Hey, I just got a frantic call from Lisa across the street from you, Michael's voice said, tinny but clear. Is someone cutting down your tree? Yes, Michael, I said, my eyes locked on Deborah's. Deborah brought a crew from a place called Karen's Cut Rate Tree Service. They've already cut through most of the trunk. She's using a forged HOA authorization with only her signature on it. There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line, followed by an explosion of angry, muffled words. What? We never approved that. That's illegal. Hold on. I'm calling the other board members right. Now we're heading over. When I hung up, I saw that the tree service workers were hastily packing up their equipment. The mention of a forged document, broadcast for all to hear, was enough to sever their loyalty to their unhinged employer. But it was too late for my Maple. They had already cut through about 80% of the trunk, leaving it mortally wounded and precariously balanced. You are making a very big mistake, Deborah hissed at me, her last shred of composure finally cracking. This neighborhood has standards to maintain. No, I replied, my voice cold and steady. You made the mistake. Trespassing, forgery, destruction of property. Should I continue? Just as the words left my mouth, a sound cut through the air, an ominous, deep, groaning creak. It was the sound of thousands of pounds of wood and life giving up its fight against gravity. The partially cut maple was starting to lean. The workers, now in full retreat, backed away quickly. I took several steps back as well, my eyes fixed on the massive trunk. Deborah, however, was too consumed by her own rage to notice the immediate danger. She was still focused on me, her mind unable to process a reality where she was not in complete control. You will be hearing from my attorney about your obstruction of official HOA business. Her sentence was cut short by a sound that silenced every other noise on the street, a tremendous, deafening crack. The massive trunk of my maple tree split where the workers had been cutting. For a terrifying, silent moment, it hung in the air, and then the entire tree began to fall. It didn't fall toward my house, or toward the workers, or even toward me. It was as if, in its final moments, the tree had a will of its own, as if guided by some cosmic, irrefutable sense of justice. My beautiful maple tree fell with a slow, majestic, and horrifying finality directly across the street. It landed squarely on top of Deborah's shiny red BMW Convertible. The sound of the impact was a sickening crunch of metal and shattering glass. The roof, which had been down to give her a better view of her victory, was crushed instantly. The windshield imploded. The car's expensive frame buckled under the immense weight of the trunk, its tires hissing as they were flattened against the asphalt. There was a moment of absolute ringing silence. We all just stared at the impossible scene. The quiet suburban street, the mangled luxury car, the massive fallen tree lying across it like a final, definitive statement. Then Deborah let out a scream. It was not a scream of anger, but of pure, animalistic agony. It was a sound that probably violated half a dozen of our neighborhood's noise ordinances. "My car!" she shrieked, her hands flying to her head. "My car! Look what you've done!" "What I've done?" I asked, my voice incredulous. "You trespassed on my property, you forged documents, and you illegally hired a crew to cut down my tree. This is entirely 100% your doing." Her face went through a fascinating, rapid-fire transformation. Shock, rage, dawning realization. And then, finally, a wave of pure, unadulterated panic as she finally grasped the catastrophic and very expensive situation she had created for herself. The tree service workers were already backing away, the foreman on his phone, presumably calling both his lawyer and his insurance company. By now, neighbors were emerging from their homes, drawn by the commotion and the thunderous crash. Michael and 2 other HOA board members arrived, their cars screeching to a halt as they surveyed the scene with wide, disbelieving eyes. The tree service workers were quick to defend themselves, explaining to the board members that they had been assured they had the proper authorization and the homeowner's full consent. In the middle of the chaos, Deborah's phone rang. She answered it, stepping away from the group, but her voice was so loud and panicked that I could still hear her side of the conversation. "Yes, it just happened. They destroyed my car." No, technically I didn't have written permission. But as HOA president, I have the authority to— "What? What do you mean you won't cover it?" "But it's their tree. Negligence. I'm not negligent. I'm enforcing standards." She ended the call and looked as though she might faint. Her insurance company, it seemed, had just delivered some very unwelcome news about the fine print concerning liability when you orchestrate an act of unauthorized tree removal that results in your own property being flattened. The war was over. She had lost, and the cost of her defeat was just beginning to be calculated. The days following the fall of the Great Maple were a blur of official activity. My homeowner's insurance adjuster, a surprisingly supportive man named Ken, visited the next day. After I walked him through the timeline of events and showed him my folder of meticulously documented evidence, the arborist's report, the photos of the initial trespassing, the forged violation notices, and the video from my security cameras, he simply shook his head in disbelief. "In 25 years in this business," he said, "I've seen a lot of strange things, but I have never seen an HOA president so determined to destroy her own car." He assured me my policy would cover the cost of removing the rest of the stump and restoring my landscaping, and then added with a wry smile, "And you can be sure we'll be subrogating against Ms. Winters and her insurance for every last penny." The HOA board, now in full-blown crisis mode, called an emergency session in the community center that weekend. Deborah, remarkably, had the audacity to attend, her face a pale, drawn mask of defiance. But her power was gone. The board members, who had once been cowed by her aggressive leadership, were now openly hostile. Michael, the retired engineer, presented a damning summary of her actions, citing the forgery of HOA documents and the unauthorized use of her authority, which had exposed the entire association to significant legal and financial liability. When Deborah tried to defend herself, claiming she was acting in the community's best interest to remove a hazardous tree, Lisa, from across the street, stood up. "The only hazard on this street, Deborah," she said, her voice shaking with long suppressed anger, "is your ego." A wave of applause and murmurs of agreement swept through the room. The vote to permanently remove Deborah Winters as HOA president was unanimous. Even her former allies abandoned her, unwilling to go down with a sinking ship. She was stripped of her title, her authority, and her last shred of dignity right there, in front of the very people she had terrorized. But her humiliation was far from over. The tree service company, facing a massive claim from her auto insurance and a potential lawsuit from me, cooperated fully with all investigations. They provided the HOA board with the forged work order Deborah had signed, a document that would become a key piece of evidence against her. My attorney drafted a formal demand letter sent to both Deborah and the now-defunct Karen's Cut Rate Tree Service, outlining the costs for property damage, trespassing, and the appraised value of my mature maple tree. The tree service's insurance company, eager to avoid a protracted legal battle, settled with me quickly. Deborah, whose own insurance had washed their hands of the matter, was left personally liable for the remaining damages. 1 week after the incident that the neighborhood had officially dubbed the Great Maple Reckoning, I received a certified letter. It contained a formal, groveling apology from the newly restructured HOA board. It acknowledged that my tree had been removed illegally and without proper authorization. Tucked inside was a check from the HOA's emergency fund, covering the full $20,000 appraised value of a mature maple tree, plus additional costs for landscaping restoration and the installation of a new, more secure fence. The BR message was clear. They were not only sorry, they were terrified of what I might do next. Attached to the letter was a copy of the minutes from their emergency session, a document I read with immense satisfaction. I was sitting on my front porch, reading this very document, when a luxury SUV with a rental car sticker pulled into Deborah's driveway. She emerged wearing oversized sunglasses that couldn't quite hide the dark circles under her eyes. The confident imperial stride was gone, replaced by the hurried, furtive movements of a dethroned queen. When she spotted me, she froze for a moment, then practically scurried toward her front door. I couldn't resist. I raised my glass of iced tea in a slow, deliberate salute. I saw her visibly flinch before she fumbled with her keys and disappeared inside her house, a prisoner in her own beige kingdom. The aftermath continued to ripple through the community. The new HOA board, led by the sensible Michael, initiated a full audit of the association's finances during Deborah's tenure. They discovered a pattern of questionable spending and unilateral decisions that went far beyond her war with my tree. She had used HOA funds to landscape her own property, to pay for consulting fees to a company owned by her brother, and to fund a series of increasingly lavish community parties that seemed to be more about celebrating her own importance than fostering any real sense of community. Faced with a mountain of debt from the car she had destroyed, the legal fees she was racking up, and the civil damages she now owed, Deborah was forced to put her house on the market. The schadenfreude in the neighborhood was palpable. The for sale sign on her lawn became a local landmark, a monument to her downfall. Inevitable, the end, I never had to take her to court. My attorney, armed with an irrefutable mountain of evidence, negotiated a settlement. She signed over the deed to her totaled BMW to me, which my insurance company was happy to take for salvage, and paid an additional sum that covered my legal fees and the cost of planting a new, young maple tree in the exact same spot as the old one. I still live in my quiet, craftsman-style home. The new HOA is a reasonable, well-run organization. The neighborhood is peaceful again. And every morning, when I sit in my home office, the sun streams through the window a little brighter, now a little warmer. It falls on the spot in my backyard where a new tree is beginning to grow, its young branches reaching for the sky. It will take years for it to regain the majesty of the old maple, but it will get there. It stands as a quiet, living testament to the fact that sometimes the most satisfying victories aren't loud and explosive. Sometimes they are as quiet and patient as the slow, steady growth of a tree.